Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Trinidad. Welcome to the panel. A few things about me. I do 3 internships here in DC. I'm a Kaplan News intern, which actually just ended this week. We are a media network in Miami for FIU. I'm also a multimedia intern for FIU in DC, where I take photos, make videos, and I set up broadcasts. And finally, I'm a Hamilton Scholar, which is why I'm up here now. And every semester we do a policy project, and I really wanted to focus on Latin America, and so that's why I'm up here. Some say I wear many hats, and they're entirely right. So on to FIU in DC, a short introduction. We are an extension of Miami's Carnegie R1 Public Research University, and we lead innovations in initiatives like environmental resilience, brain health, and defense technologies. Here we showcase impactful research. We offer exceptional academic experiences and internships for students. We showcase FIU's research directly to the federal level. And we cultivate valuable partnerships with national stakeholders, all while bringing Miami's dynamic energy to the nation's capital. So I would like to introduce our graduate research assistant, Maya Havertong, for her presentation.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Havertong. I'm a PhD candidate at FIU's International Crime and Justice program. Thank you so much for being here in person and online. I just want to get started by saying that I am one of 4 authors on this paper, and it is From Fujian to Flushing, which is going to be looking at Chinese organized crime networks, not only in Latin America, but in the United States. I guess I need a handheld. Okay, there we go. Can you hear me? Excellent. So this is one of 2 papers in the sequel. This is the sequel of 2 papers in the series. The first is the Triad Snakeheads and Flying Money paper, written by Leland Lazarus, who is the associate director over at the Gordon Institute at FIU. And then this is the paper that I will be talking about, where it's also written by Leland Lazarus as well, myself, Javier Kuan, who is a research coordinator, and as well as Nicole Ritt, who's another research coordinator, both at the Gordon Institute. I thought I was going to do that one. Okay, so just a little bit of background on the issue. There is a expansion of Chinese organized crime throughout Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and as well as the United States. The Fujian province is one of the main locations where a lot of these criminal networks are coming from. And we're seeing that in Flushing, New York, it's becoming a central hub for their operations in the United States. And we're seeing that they currently have strong ties with Mexican cartels, and they are partaking in illicit activities, including but not limited to drug trafficking, money laundering, human trafficking, especially of illegal migrants, including but not limited to sex trafficking, as well as migration, and as well as wildlife trafficking. So the first part of this presentation is going to be looking at the fentanyl crisis that's happening and the connection with the Chinese criminal organizations. So as I mentioned earlier, that they are connected with these Mexican cartels. So it starts with these Chinese chemical companies who are producing and exporting fentanyl precursors from China to Mexico. And it's a legal business over there. These are legal companies that are shipping it out. And it's coming to Mexico's cartels, specifically the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco Nueva Generación. These are the 2 leading fentanyl traffickers in the world, actually. And the United States is the main consumer of fentanyl, with over 100,000 deaths per year. So we're seeing that from these cartels, they're using international couriers to smuggle the fentanyl into the U.S., specifically from the southwest border, but we're seeing a lot of distribution in Arizona, California, New York. Essentially, a lot of the big cities are experiencing the highest deaths and instances of fentanyl. So currently, the issue with fentanyl is that it's super easy to conceal. It comes in pills, and a lot of the times it's masked into what looks like a legal product. Anything from medication pills to the pit of an avocado. And so there was a point in time where there was a freeze on avocado sales into the United States because there was a truckload of them with fentanyl and cocaine inside. So it's very, very easy to conceal and enter our country. Another contributing factor is the de minimis rule, which is a stipulation in which a package can enter the United States internationally if it's worth less than $800 without inspection. So because it can be masked as anything as small as an avocado or a little medicine bottle, a lot of the times it enters our country super easily. And then this is looking a little bit more about seizures and statistics. So we're seeing a lot of fentanyl seizures in the Southwest region, but the pill press, so when it's actual pills, we're seeing that coming throughout the North and Southwest. So all across the North, not just the Northeast, but all across the Northern United States and the Southwest. And we're seeing of the arrests from the fentanyl trafficking, 86% are American citizens. So it's not just an international concern. We're seeing the connection right here at home. And that brings us to the next component, which is going deeper into that connection between these organizations and the cartels. So it all started back as early as 2007. So our paper used a mixture of analytic resources, analytic open source research, and interviews. So we got this information of the 2007 date from a DEA director of operations who worked on the case Sleeping Giant, which went after a lot of these cartels for drugs. And he says during his time, they noticed that a lot of these cartels were making calls to China. And that goes back to 2007, illustrating that's kind of around the time that the partnership really started to thrive. So CMLOs in this presentation, it stands for Chinese Money Laundering Organizations. It's quite lengthy, but we're going to say that throughout the presentation. So just clarifying that now. So these CMLOs are in North America, and they're moving lots of cash throughout our country, and a lot of it is from drug proceeds from these cartels. And then they're bringing it back to the cartels themselves, or they're converting it into the Chinese yuan. And they're also using their global trade networks to develop a money laundering scheme. There is a plethora of these schemes, but this is pretty much a solid breakdown of the most common one. It starts back because China placed a law in which the Chinese wealthy citizens couldn't move more than $50,000 USD out of their country a year. And so when they wanted to invest in American property and real estate, things of that nature, that was a limiting factor. So they turned to the illicit markets. So you have these illicit Chinese money laundering brokers who are taking partnerships from the cartels, taking the cash and converting it all back into the yuan, partially for the wealthy Chinese to turn it into real estate investments here in the United States. Also going into feeding that fentanyl and drug trafficking problem that we mentioned earlier. And this is a really in-depth breakdown that I did not create. This is from Insight Crime. And there was a most recent case, Operation Fortune Runner, which took place in 2024, which was an interagency indictment of 24 individuals. So what that means is various government agencies, DEA, DHS, the FBI, as well as local police authorities came together to crack down on what was going on in LA. And they indicted 24 individuals, some being American, some Mexican, some Chinese, and some not either of those. But they're all part of this large scheme. So this indictment included brokers, drug traffickers, couriers, which are the ones that are running the money, essentially, and the money launderers themselves. So you can see here, it's not a particular look that they can go for or specific group involved. It's a little bit of everyone. And not only are these criminal organizations involved in fentanyl and cocaine trafficking, but they're also involved in the illegal marijuana market. So that dates back to when Colorado legalized marijuana in their state. So now that allowed for the state to tax the marijuana, and some people just don't like taxes. So what are they going to do? They're going to go towards the illegal route once again. And the Chinese organization saw an opportunity there. So not only are they using some of those fentanyl drug proceeds for the wealthy Chinese, paying the cartels, but also to fund these marijuana farms. There is multiple states, 22 states, in which we know for sure that the Chinese criminal organizations are operating in, but it could be more. Oklahoma is one of the leading ones, and their illegal marijuana growth is estimated to earn 14 to 44 billion. So that tells you we really don't know the scale, but billion is telling us that it's quite an issue. So not only are these marijuana farms involved with illegal marijuana, but they're also related to human trafficking. They're taking Chinese migrants illegally into the country, and they're misleading them into thinking that they're going to get an employment opportunity. But in turn, they're forced into these houses. Their passports are revoked. They are not allowed to leave, and they're forced to work over 20-hour days under the worst conditions involved with these grows. And if they're women, they're typically used for sex trafficking. So it's not just marijuana is the issue, the forced labor, they're not getting paid, obviously. And it goes further into that drug trafficking, there's violence, and it also funds some illegal gambling as well. This is a screenshot from our interactive story map, which is published on the FIU Security Research Hub webpage. So that's an interactive version of this very paper. So if you don't want to read the 40-page version, you get the fun one with pictures and diagrams, and it's all nice and fun. But this is a screenshot of one of those, and it's just looking at one of the areas in which there's a marijuana grow happening here. So it's really isolated. And again, these migrants are not from the United States. They don't speak the language, and they've lost their passports. They can't really leave someplace like this. They can't escape. So it also shows the severity of the location. And I wasn't done yet. They're also involved in wildlife trafficking. So the scale of this is unknown, but we know that it's very prevalent, especially throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. A lot of the waters near Asia and China have been outfished. So there isn't enough fish in their waters over there, so they've branched out into Latin America and the Caribbean to get involved there. They're also fishing shark fins because it's used for Chinese medicine. So shark fins, jaguar teeth, sea cucumber, and Tatoba fish bladders are just a few of the many illegal wildlife trafficking animals that are being affected. And we're looking at how the Chinese criminal organizations are dominating this field. So this is no longer something that is not an issue regarding the environment. It's expanding to severe biodiversity concerns. And we're seeing that it is attributed to boosting, there's an increased risk of shipping these fins into China, which is attributed to their economics, their customs enforcement. And this is just a little bit of a breakdown of one of these trafficking networks. But it varies and it expands broadly, as I mentioned. So these are just some of the locations of these operations. This is kind of just a breakdown of South America 1, which is trafficking route 1 in South America. So you can see that the countries involved. Over here, China, Suriname, Brazil, Guyana. You can see the species involved, the environmental crimes, the network, so who's involved. This is not only the Chinese criminal organizations. We see Hezbollah, we see Brazilian criminal organizations in Guyana, Venezuela, and Colombia. So it's not just a one group issue, but they are dominating this field. And then we see the other associated serious crimes being money laundering, illegal drug businesses, human smuggling, and corruption. And Project Jaguar was done in 2019. This is from the Earth League International, which is an NGO that focuses on wildlife trafficking, bringing awareness and preventing it as much as possible. So they're the ones that developed the previous trafficking route diagram. And this is one of the major operations that they did, which led to the arrest of over 5 in Bolivia specifically, but they identified 75 individuals that were involved in wildlife trafficking, which is very, very difficult to do because it's an understudied, underreported, and often ignored issue. However, the local governments did hesitate to confront the Chinese embassies, partially because they were scared of what that would mean for their country. So while we were able to identify the criminal actors involved, nothing really happened. They got let go. And we're seeing that this trafficking network is involved in, once again, the money laundering, the human smuggling, the drug trafficking. It's a lot of the same actors involved in multiple illegal activities. And this is not just something that's affecting the United States, South America, Caribbean. It is a global trend. The same things that we're seeing happening here are also happening abroad. Everywhere else, we're seeing the same groups, a lot of the same patterns, the actors, activities, all of that is happening in multiple places. So to ignore it would be a huge disservice. And that's what this presentation wanted to do, was bring attention and awareness to this really, really important issue that is often overlooked. So from this, we developed a couple of policy recommendations. These are a little bit more internationally based. One of the ones that we did have here was sanctioning and placing tariffs on China, which, if you're keeping up with the news, was already done way worse than we suggested. You know, we just had like a little bit, threaten a tariff. Well, it's not happening anymore. It's a little bit worse than that. So we took that off of this presentation. And then the remaining are looking at increasing the restrictions and the surveillance of migration coming out of the Fujian province. As I mentioned earlier, the Fujian province is home to a large percent of these criminal organizations. So if we continue to monitor what's happening there, maybe we can control some of that criminal expansion. Beefing up the law enforcement resources in Flushing, Sunset Park, LA, and Sacramento. These are the major hubs where we know a lot of the top players are. So while they may have the minor actors in Middle America, like Middle America states, we know that the main leaders are in these big ones. So if we amp up the law enforcement resources, we can probably get them at the top and dismantle the organization as a whole. And placing pressure on Bolivia, Nicaragua, Suriname, and now the Bahamas to stop the flow of the Chinese illegal migration. These are major hubs where we're getting illegal migrants coming through into the United States, and they're going through these countries. And for the last of the international recommendations is an international task force that focuses on Chinese criminal networks. I will say that my colleague, Leland Lazarus, who was the lead author on this paper, has been doing that. He has been going to various countries and bringing awareness to this topic and shedding light. So we're hoping that from his activities, we can get this task force in action. And for the United States-based policy recommendations, we're thinking we should get into contact with WeChat, which is the main communication platform that the Chinese are using, especially the illegal ones. So it's kind of their form of WhatsApp. And if we can get that banned in the United States, we can kind of control their communication here and kind of curb that connection as much as possible. We're working with Meta to monitor WhatsApp in case they just switch apps. Let's also look at increasing the funding for domestic and international port security. As I mentioned, the whole de minimis rule, we have packages coming into the United States and no one's really checking in. So let's make sure that our ports are supported and we're getting enough security there. Going into repealing that de minimis rule, which I kind of just talked about, and then adopting a nationwide cannabis industry working standards. So this will kind of enforce that protection against the migration issue, and also the concern of their forced labor. And lastly is This one's a little iffy because we have to be very careful. It can be done, if done incorrectly, could be very, very harmful. But checking and monitoring these Chinese businesses and cultural associations, because the literature is showing that a lot of these Chinese associations and cultural associations are also flipped on at nighttime to do illicit activities like brothels. So while it may seem like a cultural center during the day, at night it does tend to be a brothel. And that concludes my presentation. I do have a QR code if you want to read the very long version. Thank you so much. I'll give this to you.
We will now move on to our discussion. Do you guys need it?
I'm sorry?
The mics.
You need a mic.
Hold on. While we get them mic'd up, I would like to introduce our speakers. So our first speaker, her name is Isabel Chiriboga. She is the Assistant Director for the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arce Latin America Center. And we also have Frank Mora. He is currently a FIU professor for politics and international relations and formerly an OAS ambassador. So, U.S. ambassador, OAS U.S. ambassador. So first, I would like to kind of get your initial thoughts on the presentation. So whoever wants to start first.
Well, thank you so much, Anna and Maya. Congratulations again to you and the team, because I really enjoyed it. It's a fantastic read. Thank you, everybody, joining here today. I think this is a very important topic. We are seeing it evolve and becoming a bigger threat, not only for Latin America and the Americas in general, but it's a global threat, right? We're seeing how interconnected Chinese criminal networks are and the threat that they pose to national security globally. I would say my first couple of reactions is, well, I work specifically on transnational criminal organizations in Latin America, right? And so how intertwined CMLOs are with the TCOs that are operating in the region and how essential they have become to their operations in terms of money laundering and lowering the costs to, be able to produce their operations and to be able to continue their operations and lower the costs of drug trafficking, of illicit trade, and their involvement in the operations, make it easier to traffic different drugs and different goods across the border from Latin America to the United States. So that would be my first kind of reaction. And then my second one is, of course, on the wildlife point that you guys made, which is excellent, just to mention the illegal mining aspect of it, right? Because that's a big part of our work at the Atlantic Council, is to do research on the illegal mining operations from different criminal organizations in the region. And 40% of investments in mining in Latin America are Chinese. So what does this mean, right? The mining companies, of course, there are legal mining companies, but at the same time, they are very much involved in illegal activities. They don't respect regulation. And of course, if you don't respect environmental regulation, that results in a huge environmental and biodiversity loss in the Amazon region specifically. So that would be my I guess, suggestion for further research, to focus it a little bit more on illegal mining in the region as well. And then I'll stop there, Frank, if you want to add anything else.
So again, thank you, Maya. Congratulations to you. I think it was really a great work. So one of the things I want to mention here is that this is the kind of work that really is of great value to policymakers. This is a paper really for U.S. Southern Command and in support of the work they do. And this kind of deep dive, I would say, using open sources is invaluable even for a command that has access to classified information. And the analysis, more than just the information, I should have said that. I think it's the analysis that I think is worthwhile to Southern Command and to those involved in policymaking. Second point I want to make, it's a methodological point, which is this is again all open source. There's no classified information. If you just hear Maya or you read the paper, you're thinking, wow, where is this all coming from? Well, it's all open source. It's accessible to everyone. But I think what's interesting, and Maya, if you have time, to say how did you, the team, sort of scour the literature out there, right, the data out there to bring all this together? I'd be interested to know from that point of view how you all did that, because you're really accessing, I wouldn't say out of the way, but certainly data and information that are not readily available unless you're really looking for it. So that I'd like to hear from you about that. Third point is, if you read this paper, and love to get Isabel's comments on this, is how layered and how complex this business is, right? I mean, you really, great presentation, but you have to really read the paper to see how deep, ingrained, layered, complex, spread out this business is. I mean, you have these multinational corporations. These people operate better than any multinational corporation you could imagine. I mean, this high level of sophistication, not just in moving product, if you will, of which Maya listed, but just the way they finance, the way they raise money, the way they move money, and it's global. It's completely global. It's not just, Western Hemisphere. It's Europe, it's Africa, everyone involved and connected in ways that are very, this is my next point, very difficult to combat, right? Very, very difficult to respond to. And we can get into that a little later. Next point I want to say is, we're always under the impression that for these kinds of things, right, Isabel, to flourish, you need a kind of permissible environment, right? Weak rule of law, weak institution, corruption of officials, etc. Ungoverned or undergoverned spaces. Not true. Not true at all, because as you indicated in the presentation and in the paper, is they're in Oklahoma, like right outside for everyone to see, right? And that is that, for these operations, because of their level of sophistication, they don't need necessarily to work in an environment where it's easy to corrupt, right? It works anywhere. Some places harder than others, but it's really no longer an issue for undergoverned or ungoverned spaces or where there's weak rule of law. It happens in the United States where there is a pretty strong rule of law and there is effective law enforcement and all the rest. In other words, no one can escape from this because every country is somehow, you see operations of some kind in some country, whether it's the money laundering piece or the trafficking piece, et cetera. So it is, it is even hard to follow, to engage in law enforcement, even in places like the United States. So I think that's important too, and I noticed this in a while. There's one thing you didn't mention in the presentation that I think is very important. And that is, what is really the involvement, tacit, direct, of the Chinese Communist Party in this, right? In the paper, you say, well, we don't have direct evidence of this, right? We can't prove it, which is right to say from an methodology. If you don't have the proof, you can't say it, although that would be difficult. But this seems so rampant in a society that prizes itself in control, that it almost seems, now I'm speculating, I don't have any evidence of this, it just seems hard that at least members of the party are not involved. Now, you mentioned a couple of people in the paper that have been or are members of the Communist Party and have been and are involved, but it just seems a stretch to say that they're not involved. Because in China, if you get caught for drug trafficking, you can use your life, right? And yet there is rampant trafficking going on. It's almost as if there is a impunity that is tacitly approved, but that there are certain limits around which how much you can do, right? That's just an interesting question to me that is, again, hard to prove. But in closed authoritarian societies, to say that they can't control Fujian is a stretch, right? Which brings me to, I think, my last point, which is your paper, it focuses on this one city, province in China, right? And therefore, you have policy recommendations to address those. But isn't it true, Maya, that this business is so fungible, that it is so flexible in terms of how it can close and move and operate somewhere else, that trying to concentrate in a city per se doesn't really address the problem, right? It because of its complexity, because it's able to move and shift relatively quickly, this is more than just about a city or a province. It's really a network is what we're talking about. And it used to, when I was in government, when I was in the Department of Defense, there was a commander of Southcom, General Frazier, who says the way to combat a network is to become a network, right? In other words, when they go low, we go low, that kind of thing. And how do we develop ourselves a counter network, right, to combat this issue that is not just focused on one actor or one city or one part of the industry, right? In other words, we have to be adaptable as well. And this goes to the policy recommendations. We have to be flexible. We have to create structures that are similar to those on the other side, but that are committed to combating that. And we've been talking about that for a very long time, but we can't quite get it done, right? I understand we're state actors and it's not easy to do, but I feel like we won't be able to counter these networks, this particular business, until we respond in the same way, right? And create structures that are similar to those in which we're combating. Otherwise, I think we're just playing catch up. And that's exactly what we've been doing, right? We've been playing catch up. One last point. You mentioned this briefly, but I think it's really worth elaborating. And I would like to get Isabel's thoughts on this one. The point of strategic messaging, right? We are not doing a good job in messaging to our allies in the region this. Now, there's a lot of work we do with governments to address this, but that's below the radar. We have to be very public, because this, if our policy is countering Chinese influence in the region, part of that has to be messaging what the Chinese are doing, not just in how many ports they're building or what's the level of trade or investments. That's important. And the Gordon Institute has all that information. But it's the messaging. It is telling publics, oh, look what the Chinese are doing here. They are contributing, right, to the violence and insecurity and the trafficking that's affecting governance in your country. We're not messaging that at all. And we're not being very public about, okay, to Ecuador or to others, this is a problem we have, and therefore we very publicly have to message that we're going to work together to combat the Chinese in these areas, right? We need to do, and so I think you mentioned that, but I think I would double down even more.
Yeah. No, thank you, Frank, for those points. Very, very important. I would start with the strategic messaging, right? I think that is something that is really important. Let's take a step back and first ask, why is China so interested in Latin America and the Caribbean, right? And in general is because, of course, they want that foothold in that part of the region that is, that includes various resources that are very important to the PRC. But more generally, right, in terms of great power competition, we're looking into China is investing in major infrastructure across Latin America and the Caribbean. And governments are allowing that to happen. So yes, you mentioned ports, and China has major control or stakes, high stakes in more than 10 strategic ports in the region. And it's worth asking governments why that is the case, right? And I think to your point about strategic messaging, we're not doing a good job at communicating the long-term risks that are attached to that level of investment. Number one concern right now in the region is, of course, crime and violence for most of the countries in Latin America. But there's still that tie in between crime and violence and China is still not there. Yeah. And so thinking about ways that we can quantify that level of risk long term, I think that would be really incredible to show to multiple Latin American and the Caribbean governments, look, yes, you need the investment in the infrastructure now, and China is there to give it to you. But in the long term, what are some of the costs that the society and the country is going to bear? And in this case, we are seeing that organized crime is rampant in the region, and CMLOs and Chinese criminal networks are a part of it. And then going back to a little bit about the influence of TCOs more broadly in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm talking about TCOs such as Cartel Sinaloa, Jalisco Nueva Generación, but other TCOs that are operating in Latin America and the Caribbean. Just to put things in perspective, right? There are 35 TCOs in Latin America and the Caribbean that are U.S. Government sanctioned. And $358 billion was the revenue of these TCOs in 2023, which is 6 times the total defense budget of all countries combined. So they have a lot of money, and it is very hard for governments in Latin America to be able to combat and have the resources that they need to be able to dismantle this level of organizations. And like Frank was saying, right, there's the agility from governments and state actors is simply not there. Think about these multinational corporations. They don't need to go through bureaucracies. Governments have to go through bureaucracies to be able to pass policy recommendations and to implement policy and to be able to, have the resources and the tools that they need to be able to fight TCOs. TCOs can easily adapt, and they don't need to go through those sorts of processes. So this comes to show that, of course, in Latin America, TCOs are very relevant, but also here in the United States, we're seeing it, in multiple states. So.
Now, I have a question for both of you. Kind of like piggybacking off of what both of you said, do you think that imposing sanctions on China would be effective or counterproductive?
We're going to find out soon here, apparently. Yes, thank you for raising that. I didn't write it in my notes, but I did remember. That was an issue I had with the paper, frankly. Because on the one hand, you want to cooperate, right? And we have been actually cooperating on a few things. But if you can't cooperate and sanction, no country responds, and certainly the Chinese won't respond. It's a delicate thing, right? There are ways, I think, other than sanctioning, which is a very public way. And in China, as you know, anything in which the Chinese feel that they're losing face, immediately you're on the wrong side. So what's the right balance of using whatever leverage you have to induce cooperation, right? because of the nature of the problem that you've defined, Rich, right? It doesn't lend itself to punitive action against other actors other than those who are involved in the criminal organization. So, the jury is still out. I should say, for purpose of transparency, I do not believe, as a matter of principle, that sanctions is an effective tool, right? As a general matter. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be, but as a general matter, and certainly on this issue, understanding the nature of the threat, I'm not sure sanctions is the right, or at least we shouldn't be leaning in with sanctions with respect to China.
Yes, from my perspective, I also agree with that assessment. I think perhaps they may be effective in the short term, but given the nature and how fast these organizations and these networks move in the long term, the only thing that I think that would create is just additional tensions with the diplomatic relationship, which I do think you do need to have a certain level of cooperation, especially if you're looking into, for example, creating more regulatory mechanisms for the chemical companies that are producing the precursor chemicals, right? And you're wanting to have a little bit more oversight of and being able to I guess implement that level of regulation, you need to have some sort of level of cooperation. And to be able to do that, you need to have at least a diplomatic relationship with the country, and sanctions for that will be counterintuitive in the long term.
Okay, and for both of you also, what do you think can be done to disrupt the supply of precursor chemicals from China at the source?
It's a tough question, right? Because
Yeah.
if we would have figured it out, we wouldn't have to write this paper and do research on this. I think the best way to kind of combat the supply chain for fentanyl specifically, or any other drug that you're trying to move illegally, is to increase the costs, right? So as I was saying in my previous answer, right, ways that governments can cooperate to increase the level of regulation, the level of oversight that will drive the costs up, right, of the production of these chemicals. It's tough because they are being produced in China, so there will need to be some sort of level of international cooperation mechanism that will be able to kind of monitor these issues very closely. And I was glad to see that one of your recommendations was this task force, right? Because I think that could be a potential starting point. But as long as you don't make it harder to produce those chemicals by increasing the costs, it's going to be very, very hard to tackle the issue at source.
No doubt, very challenging. But I think your question leads me to a point that I think the paper makes, which is the nature of the problem, the nature of this particular challenge or threat, which is fundamentally transnational, right, at its core, requires a transnational response, a level of cooperation that perhaps we're not quite there yet, but if we're to be effective, we have to, okay, so what does that mean then? It just doesn't mean China and the United States cooperating. What does that mean, though, in a specific, substantive way? It really means, for example, sharing information, including intelligence information, right? Finding ways, we won't be able to do this with China, but we did it with Mexico. I remember back in the Obama administration, when we were combating, when violence really spiked in Mexico under the government of President Calderon, and he reached out to us and said, we need your help in ways that Mexico had never done for obvious historic reasons. That's the key. The key is that there was political will on the part of the Mexicans to work with the United States in ways that 10 years prior was unthinkable. And without going into details, we started collaborating on so many levels. And our level of cooperation was so layered and so complex that we were able to effectively push back on the violence and the criminal organizations within Mexico. So I would say political will, right, the commitment to address this problem and to work together and to create a structure, a task force, a mechanism by which you are basically sitting next to each other, looking at information and intelligence and shifting that intelligence into an operational situation like that, right? That gives you the kind of agility that you need to combat these guys. It used to be, we have this information, we go to Mexico, here's the, so the Mexicans would then, you know, digest the whole information and then act. By that time, it's too late. It has to be almost instantaneous. That's not easy to do, and certainly very challenging to do with China, but we could do it with our Latin American allies.
And I'll just add an additional point to that on the money laundering aspect of it, because I think that's where the U.S. really has an opportunity to collaborate with Latin American partners. There's, Latin American governments and people working in the governments are not necessarily have the capacities to be able to identify certain transactions, specifically those using crypto, for example. And that is something that the U.S. has truly led in globally. And Treasury and Commerce have done incredible jobs at being able to counter those sorts of threats. And I know that we didn't mention crypto that much, but it is also a way that CMLOs are using to launder money quite a bit. So in that way, any capacity building exercises, any information sharing or infrastructure, even technological infrastructure for Latin American governments, I think would be a very much value added into countering the operations of these CMLOs that also operate, quite frankly, with the money laundering in Latin America.
Any final thoughts before we end the discussion?
Go for it.
No, only to say that this is the kind of product that we like to see FIU students involved in and participating, and not just for a class paper. This is work that has policy relevance and that those who are making decisions are reading, digesting, and hopefully using as they do their work, right? And that is a huge advantage that FIU students have that I have to say, quite frankly, many other students in other universities do not have that opportunity. So congratulations. I hope you follow up because there's obviously much more work to be done. And you, in fact, they provide a list of future research, which is exactly what you do, research opportunities that came from this particular work. And you have a list of 10 or 12, I think, areas. So hopefully someone will catch on to that.
Yeah, congratulations again to you, Maya, and the team. I'll just say, I guess, to add a human element to it, right? Because sometimes, and I work for the Atlantic Council, it's a think tank for those of you that don't know, here in DC. And sometimes, we write papers and that's wonderful, and we make policy recommendations that are very impactful. But I'm also originally from Ecuador, and I've been able to see the human cost of the involvement of organized crime and transnational criminal organizations on big societies, right? And how they affect the social fabric, the economic costs that come with it, the political costs that come with it. And so any ways that we could make sure to incorporate that human element, I think, would be wonderful, even if it's here in the US or more broadly in the region.
Okay. Thank you so much for your insights. I will now open the floor for any Q&A.
Start there, yeah.
Sure. So my name is Arjun, and I'm a student at FIU. And seeing as a lot of the students in this room are here for a fly-in program specifically focused on AI, I want to ask about one of the recommendations that was given in the presentation, which is to increase surveillance in some of these regions where transnational criminal organizations seem to be highly present, particularly from your experience when it comes to kind of combating transnational crime, drug trafficking, et cetera. How would you say that surveillance technologies can be deployed in these contexts for crime prevention without having converse